Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a teenager, bright and eager, setting off for a year abroad. It's that classic exchange student story.
Right, full of promise.
But then a simple mistake, a wrong turn on, a festive night, leads to just an unimaginable tragedy. It sent shockwaves across 2 continents, and, well, it sparked a debate that's still going on.
It's a case that really exposed some profound differences in culture, communication, and maybe most crucially, in how societies view self-defense and gun ownership.
Absolutely. It became a real catalyst.
That did.
So today we're taking a deep dive into the story of Yoshihiro Hattori. He was a 16-year-old Japanese exchange student. His life ended, tragically, far too soon in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Yeah.
We're basing this deep dive on a detailed account of his case. We'll try to piece together the events of that night, the complex legal and cultural factors involved.
A difficult aftermath for everyone, really.
Yeah, and the enduring impact his story has had. It's quite a lot to cover.
It is. And our mission here, I guess, is to navigate through this source material. Understand the sequence, look closely at the different perspectives involved, and really try to grasp the significance of this case, both on a human level and, well, societally.
Exactly. What does this story laid out in these pages truly tell us? It's not just about what happened, but maybe why it became such a pivotal moment.
Right.
So, drawing from the account you shared, let's start by getting to know Yoshihiro Hattori himself. Who was this young man?
Well, the material paints a pretty clear picture. Yoshihiro, born in Nagoya, Japan, back in 1975. He was a middle child. His father was an engineer, his mother a homemaker.
Okay.
And at just 16, he had this really significant dream to be an exchange student in the U.S. He went through the AFS program.
And the sources really emphasize this wasn't just some vague wish, right? He wanted new experiences, friendships in a different country, and specifically, he wanted to get much better at English.
Yeah, dramatically improve his English. The plan was ambitious, too. About 10 months he was supposed to be there.
And his parents, Masashi and Miyako Hattori, they were incredibly supportive of this.
Fully supportive, which, isn't always easy for parents letting a child go so far. Mm-hmm. The account also mentions he got a scholarship from the Merida Foundation, which must have helped financially.
Looking at the details the family shared about him, his personality, it's quite striking. He's described as exceptionally extroverted, cheerful.
Yeah, you see photos of him often with fish he'd caught. Apparently he loved fishing. Rugby was another passion. Mm-hmm. And what's really revealing about his character, according to the source material, is how he actually came to the idea of the exchange. Initially, he wasn't super enthusiastic about studying abroad.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but as he got more into learning English, saw his progress, the possibility of living in America, it just sparked something. He started imagining the adventure, maybe thinking he could fish or play rugby there too.
Huh. That shift is fascinating. In his AFS application, it sounds like it really showed that kind of open, determined spirit.
It did. He wrote about being willing to adapt, be happy wherever he ended up. And he specifically mentioned wanting to share Japanese culture, even offered to make tempura for his host family.
That detail, it makes him seem so real, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And you see that willingness to try new things even after he arrived. When he started high school in the U.S., even though he had no dance experience, he chose to join the jazz dance club.
Wow.
Yeah, the sources say he was still open to other sports, but he deliberately picked something completely new. Mm-hmm. Take some guts, Curiosity.
So he was placed with the Heckomaker family. That was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Right. Richard Heckomaker, a university professor, his wife Holly, a doctor, and their son, Webb.
And the account notes they weren't new to this. They had hosted exchange students before.
Yeah, for 2 or 3 years prior. So they were familiar with integrating young people from different places.
Okay.
Yoshihiro flew into Dallas, then had that long, 6.5-hour drive down to Baton Rouge with them. And apparently right away they found him memorable. Said he really stood out from their previous students.
It sounds like his personality was just infectious. The sources say his presence really livened up Webb, their son.
Yeah, they became good friends quickly, did a lot together. And Yoshihiro's energy, his positive attitude, helped him make friends at school too.
Life seemed to settle into a pretty comfortable routine then.
It seemed so. School activities, sometimes staying out late with Webb, or he'd use the bike the Heckomakers bought him if Webb wasn't around. By all accounts, it was pretty much everything he'd hoped for.
Until that night, October 17th, 1992. Just a couple of months after he arrived, Yoshihiro and Webb were invited to a Halloween party.
And this wasn't just any party. The source material is clear. It was specifically for Japanese exchange students in the state, put on by the program organizers. Each student could bring one guest. Yoshihiro brought Webb.
And they got into costumes. Yoshihiro dresses John Travolta from Saturday Night Fever, white tuxedo and everything.
Yep. And Webb, maybe with a bit of dark humor, used a real neck brace he was wearing from an injury as part of his costume.
Okay, so they left the Heckemaker home around 7 p.m. Richard and Holly were heading out to a movie.
And here's where that small, almost trivial mistake happens. The party address was 1010131, but the boys mistakenly drove to 13110.
Wow, just the numbers transposed.
Exactly. Webb later said it was just 2 streets away, and he specifically noted the driveway of the house they went to, it was full of cars. That made them think, okay, this must be it.
But it wasn't. This house belonged to Rodney Pears, mid-30s, worked as a supermarket meat cutter, and his wife Bonnie.
Right. No party there.
So they pull up to the wrong address. Webb's looking for parking, circling the block.
So Yoshihiro gets out first, walks up to the front door, knocks.
After a moment, no answer. Then, the sources say, Bonnie Pears opens a window, sees these 2 figures in costume in the dark.
And she gets startled, screams, runs immediately to get her husband Rodney.
Rodney Pears hears the scream, hears his wife's panic. He assumes there's an intruder trying to get in.
Right. And his immediate reaction, as the sources detail, was to get his gun, a .44 Magnum revolver.
He then opens the front door, gun in hand, and confronts Yoshihiro and Webb.
Imagine that. The boys are expecting a party, maybe music, other students. Instead, they're met by a man holding a very large handgun.
Yoshihiro, still in his Travolta costume, tries to explain. The sources say he said something like, "We're here for the party."
Trying to clarify the situation.
But Rodney's response, gun raised, was just a loud command, "Freeze!"
And this is the absolute critical moment, the tragic misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Webb, being American, familiar with the term, he freezes instantly. He gets the danger.
But Yoshihiro, he's still learning English. The sources point out he might not have understood freeze specifically. Plus,
he wasn't wearing his contact lenses that night.
Right, so he probably needed to get closer just to see clearly, maybe to communicate better.
So instead of stopping, he keeps walking towards Rodney Pears. And the sources mention he's holding a camera hanging around his neck.
Okay.
Now, Rodney Pears' testimony later, as reported, claimed he felt threatened. He said he didn't understand why Yoshihiro kept coming forward after the freeze command.
And he claimed he thought the camera might be a weapon.
That's what he claimed, yes. That perception of fear, however subjective it might seem to us now, that formed the core of his legal defense later.
So at this incredibly close range, what was it, about 1.5 meters? Less than 5 feet?
Yeah, very close. Rodney Pears fired the .44 Magnum.
The bullet hit Yoshihiro in the lower left chest, hit his lung, severed a rib, just devastating.
Immediately after firing, the sources say, Rodney Pears just closed the door, went back inside, left the boys outside.
Webb, witnessing his friend shot right in front of him, he must have been terrified, panicked.
Understandably. He ran off the porch, started desperately knocking on neighbors' doors, screaming for help, telling someone to call the police, call an ambulance.
But help didn't come quickly.
No. Tragically, the response time was incredibly slow. About 40 minutes, the sources say, before police and an ambulance finally arrived.
40 minutes. And during that time, while Yoshihiro is bleeding outside, Rodney and Bonnie Pears stayed inside their house.
That's what the sources state. They didn't come back out until the authorities got there.
The wound was just too severe, massive internal damage, blood loss. Yoshihiro Hattori died, either before reaching the hospital or very shortly after.
Such a waste.
Meanwhile, back at the movies, Holly Hikomaker starts getting page after page.
Right. After the film, she sees all the missed calls, contacts the police. Initially, they tell her Webb is safe, but Yoshihiro's critical.
But the situation deteriorated quickly. The police then told her and Richard they needed to come down to the station, basically indicating Yoshihiro wasn't going to make it and legal proceedings had to start.
Imagine getting that news. It was at the police station they got the confirmation. Yoshihiro was gone.
The sources describe them as just overwhelmed with grief and feeling immense guilt, like they'd failed to protect him.
Yeah, that sense of responsibility as host parents must have been crushing.
Then came the awful task of telling Yoshihiro's parents, Masashi and Mieko Hattori, back in Japan.
The account says Mieko was just utterly shocked, distraught, became physically ill hearing the news. Just heartbreaking.
Their Hattoris flew to the U.S. 2 days later, and that meeting between the two families, the Hattoris and the Heckomakers, The sources describe it as incredibly poignant.
Yeah, especially that moment where Miyako Hattori, despite her own, unimaginable grief, her first question to Holly Heckemaker was whether Webb was okay.
Wow.
That act of compassion, it deeply affected the Heckemakers. It really cemented this bond between the two families, forged in just shared tragedy.
So the legal process starts. Initially, the police didn't file charges, based on Rodney Pear's claim of self-defense.
That's right. His statement about feeling threatened, his wife's scream, the intruder idea.
Yeah.
Initially, that's what the police went with.
But the death of a young, unarmed exchange student under these circumstances, it caused a massive outcry.
Huge outrage, not just in the U.S., but especially in Japan, where gun violence is so rare because of their strict laws. This led to significant public pressure, diplomatic pressure too. Japanese officials contacted the U.S. government.
And that pressure worked. It led to a grand jury review.
He was instrumental, yes. And as a result of that review, Rodney Pears was charged with negligent homicide.
Okay, so it went to trial. What were the main arguments?
Well, the criminal trial, as the source material describes, really centered on that self-defense argument. The defense hammered on Pear's state of mind as fear, Bonnie's scream, the costumes, the time of night.
Bonnie testified too.
She did. Said Yoshihiro seemed to rush at her, looked weird. That reinforced the idea of a perceived threat. Rodney Pears expressed regret, but basically stuck to his story. He felt he had no choice.
But there were strong counter-arguments, right? Questions raised about whether that self-defense claim held up.
Oh, definitely. People pointed to the huge physical difference. Pears, 6'10" passes, built in his 30s. Yoshihiro, 16 or 17, about 130 pounds, 5'4".
And the distance, firing from just 1.5 meters away.
Exactly. Did that seem like defense or something else? Critics asked, why not a warning shot? Why not try something non-lethal? Was the fear Pears claimed actually reasonable given everything? That was the big question.
But despite all that, the verdict in the criminal trial in 1996.
Not guilty of negligent homicide. The court, based on the sources, ultimately upheld his self-defense claim under Louisiana law at the time.
So the criminal case ended there. But the Hattori family didn't give up.
No, they pursued justice through the civil courts, filed a civil lawsuit against Rodney Pears. And this is a really important distinction, The burden of proof is different.
Right. Criminal court needs beyond a reasonable doubt, very high bar. Civil court is preponderance of the evidence.
Exactly. Meaning, is it more likely than not that the defendant is responsible? It's a lower standard.
And that difference explains the different outcomes.
It's key. In the civil trial, the court did find Rodney Pears liable for Yoshihiro's death, ordered him to pay $650,000 in damages to the Hattoris.
And the sources say he was still paying that off in installments as recently as 2022.
That's what was reported, yes. Still making payments.
What about Rodney Pears' life after all this? The sources mention the impact.
Yeah, the intense publicity was hugely negative for him. Lost his job, struggled to find work because of, his notoriety. By 2013, reports said he was unemployed, living in an RV.
Wow.
He has said publicly, though, that looking back, he wouldn't own guns again.
Beyond the personal stories and the court cases, Yoshihiro Hattori's death had this huge, lasting impact on the whole gun control debate in the U.S., didn't it?
Absolutely. It threw the U.S. approach, widespread gun ownership for self-defense, seen as a right, into really stark contrast with Japan's extremely strict laws, where private ownership is virtually nil.
And the tragedy became a major catalyst for advocacy.
A huge catalyst. The Hattori and Heckemaker families, incredibly united by their grief, worked together on this. The sources detail that amazing petition drive the Hattorists led in Japan 1.7 million signatures calling for tighter U.S. gun control.
1.7 million, that's incredible.
And the Heckemakers collected 150,000 signatures here in the U.S.
Richard Heckemaker became a really vocal advocate, didn't he? Wrote a book, got involved nationally.
He did, and both families actually met with President Bill Clinton at the time. The sources note the Hattorists met Clinton in November 93. Interestingly, that was around the 30th anniversary of the JFK assassination, another event tied deeply to gun violence history in the U.S.
Wow, the timing.
Yeah. And this powerful cross-cultural advocacy, really fueled by Yoshihiro's story, it's widely seen as contributing significantly to the momentum for the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act.
The Brady Act. That was a major piece of federal gun control legislation signed late in 93.
November 30th, 1993. It mandated federal background checks for handgun purchases from licensed dealers.
And it initially had that 5-day waiting period too, right? Though that part got struck down later.
That's right. The waiting period was initially there, the idea being, a cooling off period to maybe discourage impulsive acts of violence or self-harm. The background check part remains, though.
And the Hattori family, they've continued their advocacy.
They have, even pushing for a total ban on private gun ownership in the U.S. The sources mentioned they've used donated funds, something like 3 million bucks. Thai Bot was mentioned for educational campaigns about gun violence, using Yoshihiro's story.
But there's also a positive legacy that came out of this from the Heckle makers.
Yes, a really beautiful, lasting legacy. They set up 2 charitable funds in Yoshihiro's memory. The Yoshihiro Hattori Memorial Scholarship, helping Japanese students study here in the U.S.
Fulfilling his dream for others.
Exactly. And the Yoshi and Holly Memorial Fund, which helps American students study in Japan. They started it with their own money, and others have donated since, including the Hattoris. It's just a powerful way to turn that grief into fostering the very exchange Yoshihiro believed in.
It's also worth noting, as the sources do, that some people raised the issue of potential racial bias in the case, questioning if Yoshihiro's ethnicity played a role.
Right. That question was raised, although it wasn't the basis of the legal outcomes. Opinions on the whole thing, the events, the trial, they really vary widely. People interpret the situation and the laws differently. The court made its decision based on the evidence presented under that legal framework.
And just to quickly touch on the current context, U.S. gun laws still generally permit ownership for self-defense, right? Though rules vary state by state.
Correct. And the U.S. still have an exceptionally high rate of civilian gun ownership. That 2018 data mentioned around 120 guns per 100 people. It's just vastly higher than almost anywhere else.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear Yoshihiro Hattori's story is just so multi-layered.
It really is. It's a profound personal tragedy, a young life full of promise, cut short by a terrible accident, a chain of misunderstandings.
It's also a detailed case study in the U.S. legal system, isn't it? Highlighting those different standards of proof, different interpretations of self-defense.
And it's a powerful example of how individual tragedies, when combined with advocacy, especially cross-cultural advocacy fueled by grief, can actually become catalysts for national change and for ongoing debate about really fundamental issues.
Safety, rights, fear.
Exactly. Reflecting on this story really brings you back to those human elements, the dreams of that young student, the crushing grief of 2 families bound together unexpectedly, and these complex, deep-seated differences in culture, law, how we see the world.
What does this case tell you about the potential for just devastating consequences when you have cultural differences, communication breakdowns, and that very subjective interpretation of fear? How do events like this shape that ongoing, often really difficult conversation about individual rights versus collective safety?
Yeah, it definitely leaves you with a lot to think about.
It truly does. Thank you for joining us as we explored the details and the impact of Yoshihiro Hattori's story, drawing from the material you shared.
We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer, maybe more nuanced understanding of this really significant and tragic case.